nice to see. Can you hear? Can you hear now? Yes. Okay, it's so nice to see so many people up and about on a Thursday morning. I was very happy to step in to replace Darine. And I'm very happy to be, in particular, moderating this panel, where we hope to really have a dialogue between practitioners in the field, their vast experiences, their knowledge of the terrain, different contexts, and then, of course, scholars who are trained in a different way to see patterns over a large number of cases. So the way that we'll be doing this panel this morning is that I'll introduce each of the panelists when it's their turn to speak, and ask them if they could just give a short presentation, really 5 to 7 minutes, regarding their work and knowledge on this important topic of conflict resolution in the Middle East, using indigenous knowledge, knowledge that's generated here, and sharing that. And then we'll move more into a dialogue among the panelists, and then, of course, also try to take questions directly from the audience. Okay, so to introduce, starting first, my colleague in my department, Dr. Imad Salamey. He's an associate professor, political science and international affairs, and he's also director for the Institute of Social Justice and Conflict Resolution. So, Imad.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for being here today. And I like to take this opportunity to thank Jad Milky for having put this project together and for bringing this wonderful audience who is, I'm sure, coming from a variety of backgrounds and from different countries to discuss this very important aspect of conflict and how we perhaps can have the media play a role in this, in undermining and perhaps transforming the conflicts that we are living in the Middle East, whether confronting violent extremism or whether it is having to do with conflicts between different communities. I'd like also to take this opportunity to thank Manal Omar from the USIP for also having contributed significantly to bringing together universities and practitioners working on different projects in the Middle East and to bring in the local perspective and Middle Eastern perspectives into conflict resolution. From my side, I'm the director of the Institute for Social Justice and Conflict Resolution at the Lebanese American University, and I've been active in conducting several research regarding conflict resolution, particularly when it comes to communitarian conflicts in the Middle East, whether it is conflict that having to do with sectarian communities or ethnic communities, and as you well aware about that, this is perhaps one of the main challenges, main challenge that our region is confronting. One of these issues nowadays that we are trying to find solution to the conflict storming the region is how to bridge Shia and Sunni differences, whether this is being in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. The differences between Shia and Sunni perspectives on how to formulate a power sharing and how to advance a new state that accommodate and satisfy the different interests and perspectives of the different communities is one of the main issues that my research has been targeting, and for that purpose I have recently brought or authored a book on this issue, actually 2 books. One is on the decline of nation states after the Arab Spring and the rise of communitocracy. Communitocracy is a word that I coined to describe the emerging political regime that in many ways perhaps is serving as a medium to transform the conflict from the like Arab Spring era, where Arab nationalism and autocratic system attempted to bring together and in many ways force the different groups to give up the ethnic and sectarian identities and mold together or meld together in a single national identity. And now it seems to me that what we are moving more in the direction of is the establishment of a state that can in many ways accommodate or at least respect the different ethno-sectarian and communitarian identities of the different groups as a transitional situation or perhaps a more sustainable system. So this is some of the research that I've been focusing and concentrating on. Recently also I edited a book that target the different power sharing agreement arrangements possible for Syria. How can Syria move from its current conflict toward a more sustainable peace, given the deep rifts between Alawi, Sunni, Kurds, and other groups such as Christian and Druze. So as you see, many of my research has tried to address concerns concerns that are primarily communitarian and try to forecast possible political system. I must say that there are plenty of work to be done in this regard, and definitely conflict resolution as a field of study provide us with so many tools, so many ways, so many means to examine these challenges and these conflicts. We are seeking to bridge further the issue where many civil society groups or many organizations have been trying to address conflict resolutions in different areas of Lebanon, such as USIP, among others, War Child, perhaps. And these initiatives and activities that attempt to either mediate, facilitate, or try to bring an end to conflicts, unfortunately have not been captured by the academia. And I think this panel brings us closer to addressing this issue and perhaps can stage further initiatives in that regard. One of them, Manal, Omar, and myself seek to capture different best practices being accomplished by local efforts, and some of them by international organizations such as the USIP in Iraq and Syria. We would like to capture these best practices in conflict resolution and perhaps develop a database for them, organize conferences around them, and create publications that can be mainstreamed to academia and become useful to university students in a way they attain and develop their skills in conflict resolution. So looking forward for our collaboration, looking forward for greater collaborations between civil society and local organizations and academia. I think this is extremely important to make our experiences from the region, particularly the Arab region, which is loaded with conflicts, and of course loaded also with attempts to resolve these conflicts, to build all the knowledge of conflict resolution and become leading in the world in this field. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Imad. And I think you provided an excellent segue into Manal Omar. Here we are, who's Associate Vice President, Middle East and Africa Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and CEO and founder of Across Red Lines.
Thank you, Jennifer. And a special thank you to MDLAB for hosting this panel and to the Lebanese American University, and especially to the partnership that's developing with Dr. Imad Salamey, because I'm going to be really honest with you, I'm obsessed with this topic. I think for a very long time, for over 20 years, I've been doing conflict resolution in the Middle East and Africa, and it is a situation where we need all hands on deck. We need everyone, every sector to really be working together. And I like Edward Said's quote, where he said that I can die and come back in 100 years and start my lecture with the current crisis in the Middle East, because we've been in crisis for decades, and will probably continue to be so. But just like we have conflict, that means we have peace building. That means we have conflict resolution. And that's really what I'm looking more and more towards, is how do we extract the information that already exists in the region from regional experts. And the reality is, the academic alone will not be able to offer the solutions. It really is a mix of practitioners who are on the ground doing the mediation, doing the humanitarian work, but oftentimes may not have the time or space to actually download the information and the lessons learned. Or if they do, it's very much in an anecdotal fashion where you can't translate it to the academic, where you're able to actually determine the patterns and what are the areas. But the two are absolutely necessary if we want to see change and initiate change in the region. And I personally think that that's a big part of the missing piece. And from my perspective, and one of the things that I often emphasize in training, is that conflict isn't always negative. Conflict can actually be something that's positive. It leads to accountability, it leads to growth, it leads to all kinds of dialogues to take place. What's negative is when it turns to violence. And I think that's a big part of the marriage between the academic and the practitioners, is that if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And at this point, when it comes to conflict resolution, the only tool we have is violence. And whether it's on the local level, people believe that violence is strength, or if we're honest, even on the international level, our first reaction is violence. And so really being able to determine what works in conflict resolution, because we can't keep, especially for youth who want change, we can't keep going and telling them, put down your guns, there's no violence, but then have no alternative for action, because they want to take action. And so if we're not actually able to give them the tools of nonviolence that leads to tangible change, then it continuously pushes towards more violent action. But I want to give 3 specific examples of things that if you only take an academic lens, you may miss, that practitioners have really been able to highlight. So first, for those who study conflict resolution, they often teach you about the curve of conflict. I don't know if anyone's heard of the curve of conflict, but it really starts kind of from the beginning. What does pre-conflict look like? What does build up to conflict? And then you often have conflict, then you have stabilization, and then after stabilization you have nation building. And there are all these different stages to conflict, and they call it the arc of conflict. Now, I've done conflict resolution for 20 years, and I can tell you, I've yet to see any conflict that follows that curve, right? It's like a dance. You could be in stabilization today, and tomorrow you're in the thick of real conflict. One city could be in complete post-conflict liberation mode, and the other city is on fire. And so in that sense, practitioners often turn and they look at the curve of conflict and say, great in theory, has no use for us in actual day-to-day war zones or in conflict. So that's one example. Another example is oftentimes with negotiations, you're trained about negotiating from a place of interest. And so they tell you, try and figure out the different parties' interests and try to figure out what their benefits are. But what we forget is oftentimes, and specifically in conflict, but also in natural disasters, you're talking about highly traumatized people and populations. And they won't be negotiating all the time from a place of interest. So if you're not folding in the trauma, you're actually missing a big piece of any negotiation or any peace talks, which is unfortunately often the case because we're simply looking at it from a very calculated, interest-based negotiation standpoint. And then the final thing that I would say is the power of the invisible and the power of the informal. It's incredibly powerful in conflict resolution and on the ground. But again, because oftentimes we love the visible, we want the benchmarks, we want the success stories, we actually may force, and one of the things I talk about a lot is the US will hug people to death. People with really strong legitimacy that could make change in their community, by promoting them too much, we actually can delegitimize them because suddenly they become affiliated as an international or a US favorite. And so we actually forget that there's an incredible amount of power in the informal and in the invisible. And oftentimes it's practitioners that are the ones that highlight that you can't capture everything. And especially in the day of monitoring and evaluation where people think what's important is always measurable, which isn't always the case. But again, I think it's the practitioners that are the ones who tend to ring the bell and say, make sure you're factoring in these parts as you're doing the analysis.
Okay, excellent. And you brought up many different points that I hope that we can continue discussing during the dialogue. And now I'd like to turn to Aoun, who's the Regional PSS Advisor for War Child Holland.
Hi, thank you for hosting me. Thank you for Manal and for MDLAB. So what's bringing me to conflict resolution and to research? I'd like to share a little bit of my experience. At War Child, we do mainly child protection, we do psychosocial support, and we do education. So, like in principle, in theory, it's much away from conflict resolution. The moment we moved from just providing aid to Syrian refugees and moved to providing the aid to the communities, to a community-based approach where everyone in the community is entitled to humanitarian support, especially that we know in the Syrian crisis in Lebanon, Syrian refugee has fled to the most vulnerable communities. And what we do is psychosocial support for community mainly, it's all around the children. We discovered that if we don't do any kind of social stability, let's call it for political reason, we will not be able to build the resilience of the community and of the children. So this is what brought us to conflict resolution, where we did something called the peace team, where we provide the youth with some tools to be able to be more open to each other, build positive relationship, and know how to solve their conflict in a positive way. So, and then they said, it's fantastic what we're learning here, and we were putting together various youth from different backgrounds, Lebanese, Syrian, Palestinian, even Iraqi, or even from different religious backgrounds. And they were learning little by little about how to be open, empathetic, how to solve the conflict in a positive way. And then they said, why we didn't learn that from before, from when we were young. And this is where, through a small fund from USIP, we developed something similar for the young children, where we did a combination of psychosocial support and conflict resolution for young children through storytelling. It's a main character that will help children to solve their problem in a positive way. And at the beginning of the crisis, we were just here trying to support, to give any program, any methodology to support the children. Today, there's a shift. Donors are not accepting anymore to give any fund if we do not prove that our methodology, our programs are working. So we need not just to give best practices, best lessons learned, but also evidence-based. And beginning by the evidence-based, what's an evidence-based? Is this just thorough, rigid research or observation from the field? Here where between the practitioners and researcher, the gap begins. So today at War Child, we are aiming at developing 9 interventions for psychosocial that are evidence-based. And the clash begin between practitioners and researchers. Researchers are coming from European countries. It's London King College. It's people having a Western mind, very thorough on research, very strong about research. And people coming from the field with the experience, coming directly from the field, understanding better the communities, and the clash begin. And it took time. And my specific role at War Child, other than being the PSS regional advisor, is to bridge this gap between researcher and practitioner. How we can have a thorough research while having an open mind. And what we're doing is inviting the researcher to come to the field to understand the challenges we are facing. If we're randomizing the groups, because we do some of the random controlled trials, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, it's not easy for the community always to understand why my children should be in this place, not in this place, not with the brothers, not with the sisters. If we're doing a competency building trainings for why it's 5 days long, why are we doing all these papers, why are we signing all this? So these are the small challenges we are facing. So what we're trying to do is to build on these challenges little by little to be able to really bridge between researcher and practitioners. And what it takes an open mind. What we lack in Lebanon today, and we're moving it, we have the laboratory here. Sadly, it's one of the biggest crises, and the fund has shifted. So any donor is asking for a rigorous monitoring and evaluation framework and asking for all these indicators which are not all the time easy to measure. How can I measure that a child is doing better? How can I measure that he's having more friends? What's the scientific? How can I measure that he's talking more positively to his friend? He's building positive relationship. How can I measure that he's trying to do a win-win conflict resolution? This is really, really difficult. And this is what we're trying to do. But what needs to be done is to have an open mind where the researcher can come a little bit to the field and the practitioner go a little bit and see it from a researcher perspective. Today, from a NARAB perspective, we have the biggest lab here. We have the fund. What we need to do is to build our own research, our own theory of practice from our own communities. Not everything coming from abroad not all the theories can happen here. And like Manal is saying, on the field, nothing is linear. This is the first phase, this is the second phase. Everything can be like, can start over from point zero, whereas we're saying that we have built enough, and this is the theory, and we're doing it by the book. So I do think this is the opportunity. For each conflict, there is something positive, there is a chance, an opportunity. For this conflict, this is the chance. We are having people interested in us, funds being given for research, for best practices. Let's take the chance to do it from a local, from a regional perspective, not just to take theories from outside and try to implement it. Let's do it from the field upward, and not just from upward to the field. So this is mainly what I wanted to share with you. And I think there will be some place for discussion and questions later on.
Hey, thank you very much. And something perhaps that we can talk further about is greater professional respect. And I would say, I mean, going from, of course, researchers to people, practitioners, but also practitioners to researchers in terms of their strengths, and definitely the open dialogue, which you mentioned. And now we'd like to turn to Youness Aboyoub, who's the Chief Governance and State Building Section at ESCWA.
Hi, good morning. I'm going to give a few ideas, or at least talk about my experience. Before I joined ESCWA, I worked in different conflict countries, Sudan, Chad, Nigeria, and other places, but mostly in the region the last few years with the special envoys both in Libya and Yemen. And I'm really happy that such a panel and dialogue is taking place, because this is really an issue that when you work on the ground, you really suffer from. There's no need to go into a lot of theoretical talk about this. I will talk about what I have seen and how I lived these experiences. I think there is a question of difference between the theoreticians and the practitioner, at least in two spaces. First, the tempo. Second, the perspective. Within the United Nations or international community interventions around the world, we usually, even if we talk a lot about prevention of conflict, we don't do much in prevention. So you're hit in the face by a conflict, and all of a sudden you have to intervene to stop at least the bleeding and do something quickly. And practitioners usually are put in a situation where they have to act very quickly, quick fixes, so it looks more like managing conflict than resolving conflict. While an academic, he has more time to think about things. He will go deeper into the situation. Maybe it will take him a longer time to reach solutions. By that time, maybe either the conflict has ended or has shifted to something much worse. It depends. What I'm saying is, doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It means that we need to find ways to fix this issue with the tempo, where the two can come together and work. The second thing is a question of perspective. When you are involved in a conflict, trying to resolve it, sometimes you're so deep into it that you lack the distance, and you sometimes lose your neutrality because you're dealing with people, we're humans. As an academic, looking at things from far, it has its pluses and minuses. The minus is, of course, that you're not really seeing things as they are in reality. The plus is that you still have that distance that the practitioner lacks and needs, actually, to be able to keep its neutrality. There's also something else, which is a question of knowledge about the culture and the country you live in or you work in. Practitioners cannot know everything about all these countries. They usually spend 1 year here, 2 years there, in completely different cultures, and it takes a long time to be able to understand what's happening. I'll give 2 examples. When I was in academia, I both as a student, later on as an academic, we learned, for instance, in issues of post-conflict transitions that to build new legitimacies, you go through elections. And this is something that I think is still taught in universities. I beg to differ with this because I've seen it firsthand how this creates chaos. I'm not saying that it is the same in all situations, but what we need to understand that this is not a sine qua non condition for legitimacy or for post-conflict peace building, and actually it can be even worse, and sometimes it can be very harmful. And the case I would like to talk about briefly, we can always discuss it later on in Q&As, is Libya. When we went to Libya after the revolution, the idea was very simple. You come in, you organize elections, you have a democratic regime, and that's it, it's done. What most internationals who were there did not realize is that Libya has something very specific that other countries do not have. It was a stateless society. You reach immediately for a power sharing agreement in a completely political vacuum. You don't have a state to make it democratic or undemocratic. You need to have a state first. So we lack the fact that we didn't understand that since 1951, which is the creation of the Libya as we know it today, neither the monarchy and the Senussi nor in 1969 Gaddafi were interested in building any state. Actually, Gaddafi had this idea that the state is the enemy of the people. So when we came in, and all of a sudden we said, okay, let's organize elections. In literally a few weeks, you moved from a society that never had any political party to one that had over 83 political parties. And you quickly organize elections, you have a new elected regime, but actually what the international community did, without realizing it, is that it was not even power sharing, it was bounty sharing. And it led to a cascade of catastrophes. So I think if we had the time, or we had at least relied more on academics in that situation, probably would have avoided such a thing. This is just one example. There are a lot of others. In Yemen also, someone before talked about the different communities and sectarian divide. In Yemen, for instance, in the issue of immediately, actually, this is between brackets, Also, when the practitioner comes in, most of the information that most practitioners, not all of them, most, they get from media. It's quick, it's easy. So when you come, you already come with a certain mindset, a certain perspective. You go to Yemen, okay, it's a proxy war, you have Shia against Sunnis. Actually, Yemen was not like that at all. The war was not sectarian, and actually I would even say, you can even talk about the sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia because the Houthis are not Shia, they're Zaydis. And it's a completely different thing. And because you come in with this idea in mind, your whole perception of the conflict is different. And then that leads you to try to find certain solutions that would not fit. So I think, again, academics could help a lot in this. And they're not only saying that they would write books and people would read them before going, because it doesn't work that way. I don't think most people would read these thick books. Let's be very, yeah, unfortunately. I think, I think there was an idea that we did, and it worked during the national dialogue in Yemen. Actually, we had embedded academics. We brought academics from different universities, and we had them with us for months to organize the national dialogue in Yemen. But this does not happen or work all the time for different reasons. The best would be probably to have a philosopher king, as Plato said. You have someone that has both, which is a rare breed. I was in a situation where the envoy was actually a quite famous academic who was doing the negotiations as an envoy. It was ideal because for the first time I saw in special political missions where you would have a weekly meeting called thematic discussions, where one theme about that country would be brought in, for instance, whatever called the nature of society, history. I have never seen in any other mission before. That was a great plus, where people would face their new ideas and learn about the countries they're in. But also, it has also, unfortunately, its downfalls, where does the practitioner start in a negotiation and the academic end? Because as a practitioner also, you have sometimes to take off that academic gear and probably do certain things or push certain things in a certain way that an academic would not do. And if you give too much space sometimes for negotiators, you might lose control over things. So these are just a few examples from what I have seen and lived through, and then I hope we can have more discussions about this afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing those experiences. And then last but not least, Dr. Elie at Hiny from NDU, who's an associate professor of political science and public administration.
Thank you. Speaking last is always a problem because most of the things have been said, so we'll try not to repeat a lot. I will try also to bring in some factors that haven't been mentioned. Well, as has been said frequently, we have the blessing of being in the Middle East, which is the double-edged sword of having conflict, but also the opportunity of being leaders on conflict resolution. And unfortunately, all the good experience that we have, and maybe also the bad experience that we have, haven't been put in a way to actually advance the field of conflict resolution or peace building in the proper way. That's mainly, in my opinion, and probably everybody here agrees, that it is because of the gap that we have between academicians and practitioners, as it has been said. Very quickly, without repeating a lot, I think the practitioner has a very vested interest in bridging this gap with the academia. First, to document all his work and all other people's work, document the successes and failures, to document the process that he has been through, and hopefully translate that into later on analyzing the applicability of theories, defining the trends, the patterns, the lessons learned, etc. And as Manal said also, most of the time the practitioner does not have the time to do this, and maybe even does not have the knowledge to do this from an academic perspective. Presenting a more contextualized knowledge, it's very important. both as we just heard that the practitioner should know the country properly and know the context properly, but also the other way around, for the academician to put the theories in context and see whether they are really suitable for this context or not. Should we adjust? Should we redefine? Should we amend, etc.? And of course, the nice work that LAU and USIP have been doing, which is sharing the best practices that you can learn from and that you can achieve better results. As a practitioner, it's your interest to have these in your hand, written in a proper academic way, in a suitable way. For the academician, on the other hand, it's always been an accusation for political science that it is, somewhere in the theories, somewhere in the ivory tower, that does not really have, is in touch with reality. And there's always an interest for the academicians in political science and in peace building to see that they are really working in an applied science, they are really working on evidence-based, on research-based, to have the sense that their work is actually bearing fruits in reality and not just in theories. Ensuring that their teaching is thus not purely theoretical, but also with that. The other factor I want to bring in and then build on later on is actually the interest of the students. And since also here we have students, it is a very important thing for the academician to know that what he's teaching his students is actually the reality, something that they will actually use in the field of work later on. We hear mostly students saying, well, we're not actually, when they work into the field later on, saying that we are not using anything that we have learned in school or in the university. It's actually a very important thing for an academician to feel that he is giving his students not only things that he will use, but also skills we call them life skills or practical skills that they will be useful for them in their life later on. One final point in that comparison is that whenever a student leaves the university, he is asked for experience, and then we have nowhere to actually get that experience. The effort of bridging the gap between practitioners and academicians and to have students involved in practical things would actually be very useful in building this experience while you are in the university, before going into the field and then everybody asking you for experience that you don't know where to get. On that regard, I think we have a lot of need in the civil society, and many of us have experience in civil society. We always need human and financial resources to do a lot of work. We need volunteers, we need people to do certain works that we cannot afford. On the other hand, we have universities full of students searching for practical experience. So I really couldn't understand why we can't make this matching of the needs, where civil society needs the students and their knowledge, academic knowledge, but also needs them as human resources to do certain research. In that regard, I'm going to share two or three small experiences with you about this link that have benefited the students, but that also have tried to transfer or bridge the gap that we are speaking about. It's not maybe high-level peace building or conflict resolution in the Middle East. It's rather my experience and my work have been on building the very basic level of peace building, which is making everyone in the society a peace builder or a mediator. In that regard, when I first came back to Lebanon and started teaching, it was almost 25 years after the end of the war, and I asked my students in Notre Dame University, which is a Christian university in a predominantly Christian area, to go and visit some civil society organizations. And it happened that some of these civil society organizations were in Beirut, and I was surprised in Western Beirut, between brackets, which was the Muslim area of Beirut during the war. I was so surprised and shocked to see some of my students saying, no, we don't go to that area. I said, what's that area? It's Beirut, it's the capital. And I realized very quickly that after 25 years of the end of the war, we still have the walls, we still have the separation, we still have the fear from each other. So the first thing I did after that is to pick up my students and go visit a Palestinian camp in Western Beirut to give them that shock transition, maybe, if you want to put it this way, and to show them in reality how the breaking that wall would actually show you that the people have a lot in common and a lot of similarities. And since then, we've been trying in every year to have some kind of inter-religious or inter-university or inter-community effort between the students to meet and to discuss their issues, to decide the history, the social needs, the work environment, etc. And automatically you would see how these people have a lot in common and they have much less in conflict. So building on the common things to push forward. Another experience is we realized through our leadings as academicians, 2 or 3 professors in NDU, that religious leaders have been playing a very negative role in the conflicts, specifically in Lebanon, specifically between Sunnis and Shiites, or between Muslims and Christians, or between Alawites and Sunnis. So we associated ourselves with an organization and tried to aim at religious leaders and trying to make out of these religious leaders mediators and peace builders. So we worked for more than 2 years with different religious leaders in Tripoli after the conflicts between Sunnis and Alawites, and after, of course, the number of Christians was decreasing continuously. And after 2 years, we have now something called the Sustainable Network for Religious Leaders in the North that is working to a large extent as a buffer zone to solve small conflicts in communities, to bring people together. And the interesting thing is that these religious leaders automatically decided to go towards the community. And they worked with schools, with universities, with civil society, and with future religious leaders to pass their experience and to transfer their knowledge in that. One last point is also a partnership that we did with another civil society organization, which is ALIF, Act for Human Rights, of which I'm also a member. We took the students to something very similar to what we heard about bridging the gap between the community, the host community, and the refugees. So we actually took the students to have a look at the situation on the ground, to do a survey, to do a study about the village, about the potential tension issues, and of course to present academically possible solutions, how to diffuse the tension, how to create a communication tool, how to work with the municipality and the local police, etc., to de-escalate any tension or to prevent any possible violence that could happen. In all these 3 experiences, and of course several others, you cannot imagine the richness that I have had in my class from the students who have participated in such events, which made the classes much more useful and much better academically, but also in practice. So just I wanted to add this perspective that maybe was not covered properly, but also we agree on most of the things that have been said. And I will stop here and maybe we'll have some discussion later. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Elie. I think maybe just building off of what you said in terms of training a new generation of individuals who perhaps will not be as divided between academia or scholarship and practitioners, but from the very beginning will perhaps have tools that they can use from each side. Over the various things that have been said, one of the things that's been striking to me is that it seems that there are definitely some language gaps or terminology gaps. When I heard Manal remark that not everything is measurable, and I looked at my colleague Imad and said, no, it is. You just have to break it down further. But that's my scholarly training. And I was wondering that, among other things, I mean, in terms of language or other challenges that you see to bridging this divide. I mean, I think we can all agree that the people we have on this panel have already done quite a bit to bridge that divide in their own personal work, whether they be practitioners or scholars or seek to mix that. But how else can you spread this knowledge, this experience, so that others can perhaps not have as steep a learning curve?
Well, all right, thank you. You're right. I mean, it depends on how empirical you are. If you were talking about academic perspective, whether things are measurable or not measurable, and to what extent you and how exact you can be in measuring, especially social phenomena, because social phenomena in many ways it involved a lot of feelings. But let me go back and focus on USIP's work. And I'm taking your role here, but I really think this is extremely important what Manal is doing. USIP is trying to develop a network of facilitators around a region and try to negotiate different local conflicts and build up the perceptions of peace building from bottom up. I think what is being done is very important for us as academia-wide. I'm just gonna talk to you about this from a personal experience. Last semester I was teaching a class on violent extremism, and I had to teach my student of how we measure extremism and how we could analyze extremism, especially now extremism is very much associated with Islam and with regions, with Muslims in the regions and so forth. So as an academic person, I have to rely on references and sources that I found out they are primarily, just I was mentioning, they were primarily authored and developed by Western scholars. And look at the databases around, like terrorism data, the global terrorism data. It is a highly relied on as a database whereby terrorism is defined in certain ways, in certain terminologies, that in many ways, I thought that may not be applicable to many groups around the region, that this database, put all these groups in there. Also, I mean, the work that being done by governments with scholars in the West, like Homeland Security in the United States, these are pretty politically loaded data being provided to scholars to examine and analyze. So, I must say this, I had a hard time trying to justify to my student the scientific basis, the measurable indices being provided to the student in the seminar. So therefore, I think today in this region of the world, we definitely need the practitioners. We need to build on local experiences and provide not a counter, but definitely a correcting narrative to existing scholarship work around the world and provide a local perspective. That's why I was saying that USIP perhaps in our work together may start to bring more objectivity to scholarship, which I'm happy that you and ESCWA and World Child, we're bringing together academia and practitioners to think loud, perhaps, and definitely we need to build on this. We need to develop conferences. One of the conferences we developed last year brought on Syria. We brought all kind of groups coming from religious backgrounds, coming from civil society communities, universities, from different, to share experiences and discuss ways to build a more appropriate, perhaps, a paradigm to examine conflict resolution.
Small addition from the experience. There is a term in French which says vulgariser le langage. I don't know how we translate it in English. We need to make the language more simple for people to understand. Not everyone is familiar with indicator, with measurement. Make it more simple. Keep the measurement as they are, but once we are explaining it, for me personally, whenever I want to explain for people, I do psychosocial. What's psychosocial? We're not sick, we're not mentally ill. So I find ways to explain in the communities, not just in the communities, everywhere I go, what I do in simple words when I talk about human suffering, why people need some support, why people need friends around them. And this is what we need to do. Make the language a bit more simple for everyone to understand it. And when you make it simple and explain for people, they are more willing to understand it. And whenever we are in the field with people, the old traditional way of learning cannot apply. What we do is we do it learning by doing. So we do not give, like when we are talking about empathy, conflict resolution, dialogue, importance of being in each other's, understanding each other's perspective, we do not just say it by rules and by theories. We make people experience it's an activity so they can understand. So this is one of the things, make the terminology more simple for people to understand it. I was given a mindfulness exercise to provide for Syrian refugee and relaxation and breathing for them to relax. And from my experience, like the moment you say breathing and close your eyes, they will laugh at you. Mm-hmm. So I asked from the expert in mindfulness, please give me a presentation while you explain the biology of it, but in very simple words. Like what's happening, don't say hypothalamus and the hormones, and say what's happening in the brain, what's happening to the heart rate, what's happening on the long term. And he did it. Once he did it, 25% in the group every day were practicing mindfulness. But this is a way on how we can do things in a simple way, make everyone understand it, and then become the one who will be doing it and the one who will teach about it.
Maybe just to also come from my own experience, it is something that has become very known that if we give a lecture, maybe 10% of the knowledge would stay. If you participate in a discussion, maybe 30% of the knowledge would stay. If you ask students to do something, they will actually learn and have most of it. So I guess if we are going to give 3 very practical points for us as universities to do, is first to incorporate in every course some kind of practical perspective. Second is to contextualize the theories that we give, also from the realities that our students live in and that we live in. Now this becomes a bit challenging when you're teaching a general education course, like when you have 25 students of business and engineering trying to teach them introduction to political science, and they hate your guts for having to take that course. And that is a real challenge to make them understand why it's necessary for them to do that. And we do the effort there. So we should do it all the time by contextualizing the theories. And maybe the last point is, as Dr. Salamey said, and maybe also Manal, to produce more literature locally, to have our own perspectives into things, to study in our own books rather than purely Western books or other kind of books that we import from outside. Thank you.
Just a couple of things that I would add. One is on the vocabulary. Like everything in the right place. And I've seen people who are doing intake forms that will tell people, you're not a refugee, you're a migrant. You're not a migrant, you're an IDP. Like the person in front of you, they just want to be processed. So like that I think is one of the important lines between the practitioners and academics. Like even if it's important to us behind the scenes, you don't need to lecture the participants or the beneficiaries on what they are or what they are not. In terms of the measurable thing, I think that it's really important, I mean, especially when you're looking at conflict resolution and peace building, because you're often in a position where you have to prove a negative. Because we did this, then we didn't have conflict breakout, which is very difficult to do. You're also often, whether it's humanitarian or man-made, whether it's natural or man-made, it's very difficult to actually collect information because you're in what you described as the triage. We're in there, we're trying to stop the bleeding, so being able to collect is often difficult. And I think one of the other issue is then how do you actually create a control group? Like if you have access, you're not going to then create a control group. I think there's ethical issues with that if you wanted to really actually be sound. And I'm an economist by training because I tend to believe that conflict comes from resources. I'm not a huge believer in identity as a source of conflict. I think people manipulate identity to push conflict forward, but oftentimes I think it's usually economic and resource-based. So this issue of measurable is something, as an economist, that I'm always really, really struggling with. And I think one of the key, kind of your question about how do we push it further, is donor education. Because I think donors have also pitted us against each other, you know? So like when you're applying for a grant, you kind of have to shoot down the academic institutes to talk about why an NGO is the only one who can really solve this. And when academics are applying for a grant, they kind of have to shoot down why the practitioners and the NGOs aren't the best because we have the data. So you're put in that position because of the way grant is. And I think that the donor education piece is a really important piece where we can go to donors and say, you actually really need both. And here's what this side brings, here's what this side brings. And I think the more we're able to actually push back on donors and educate donors on context, on using national expertise and stuff, the easier, hopefully in the future for the next generation, where it actually becomes a requirement. I mean, that's what I would like to see, where like donors actually requiring who are your partners that you're working with, then we'll give you a grant, versus encouraging us to kind of push them off the table and take all the money.
I do agree with most of what has been said. Just 2 points. One about this discussion about being able to measure things or not. I mean, yes, ideally we could be able to measure 100%, but we're dealing with humans, and most of all, I think when you work in this field as a practitioner, you realize that rationality is not always there. Things happen for very strange and stupid reasons, and you would come and write history later on and say that decisions were made on such and such day because of geopolitical. It's not always like that. I have seen certain things where I'm laughing at them now because certain decisions were made because somebody did not sleep enough that night, or very basic things, but you would never think about them. So it's very hard to put this into scientific theory when we don't realize that these are very basic, probably trivial things that happen and makes conflict either go wrong or maybe get solved. The second thing is about this Western perspective or outside perspective from the region, which is actually, it has its pluses and minuses, but I think it's becoming a problem more and more, because a lot of people in the region start talking to each other and know each other via a third party that is completely outside. And that person, with all the good intentions, does not have always the tools to do it. And I think we need to build this generation of local actors that have both the information, the knowledge, the skills, and also the empathy and also the interest to solve their own issues. We call it local ownership. We use this term a lot, but I haven't seen it really happening. I think it's high time people in the region start taking things in their own hand and start to do it by themselves.
Are there questions from the panel members themselves that they would like to ask each other, or issues that they would like to raise? So maybe, yes, a question here, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody. I want to ask what you mean by rationality. It could be defined differently from, it could be defined from somebody to another, or a sect to another sect, or a religion to another religion. The second question is, what about the new media? Has it contributed to solve the conflicts, or maybe to enhance the hate speech, for instance? And the third one is, have you used new media, especially social media, to push forward understanding between religions and sects? Thank you.
The question about rationality, what I meant by it? We have the tendency when we look at events unfolding around the world, we see them through TV, or we read either history or analysis in serious academic journals, that everything is well thought of in advance and decided. The extreme side of it is this, what do you call it? Conspiracy theory. And then people think, oh, there's absolutely people deciding things and everything is already thought of and measured. It's not always that way. Absolutely not. I was in a situation where a war, or let's say a violent confrontation, could have been avoided if the person in charge that time was awake to make that decision, and he was not. And I cannot say who, the name. This is in a conflict that is still happening today. And it was as basic as this. Or because of the moodiness of certain persons, or not necessarily thinking of the consequences of certain acts, people could act in a very irrational way, out of personal hatred to someone else, not thinking of what this would do to the country, for instance. So what I mean by irrationality is we should try to look at human actors not as really always rationally thinking machines. We're not. We're human beings, and certain of our decisions lack complete rationality. And that's why it's very difficult sometimes to find ways to measure these things, because how would you do it?
I'd like to add some comments to that questions regarding rationality. I like to suggest that conflict resolution is a very rational-based field, because for every conflict there are gains and there are losses, and eventually we can, whether they're economic or otherwise, and therefore every conflict you could develop some kind of rationalism to it. So you would say some conflicts perhaps are good conflicts, especially if they are, like Manal was mentioning, if they're non-violent, they may even provide us with lessons, give us encouragement to develop and progress. Economic conflict sometimes is good. If you're a liberal, you would think that economic conflict, whether between companies or between states, give you incentives to improve and to be more efficient and productive and make more profit. Good conflicts. Some conflict, I would say, they're ugly conflicts. And these ugly conflicts are typically conflicts that are unavoidable. Take, for instance, conflict with Nazism in the world. I mean, how could you have avoided such conflict? The rationalism of avoiding this conflict is pretty difficult to achieve in a positive way. Or if you were thinking about like Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how could you have avoided this? Or Israeli occupation and later on resistance to occupations in southern Lebanon. Some of these are what I call ugly conflicts that conflict resolution field cannot easily find, an easy exit or prevention. There are bad conflict. The third category, I would say, there are bad conflict that are perhaps could have been avoided if the rationalism was calculated appropriately. I mean, look at, for instance, the Lebanese Civil War. The cause of that war has been tremendous for what it has achieved as an outcomes. 100,000 people or more died, million people injured, million displaced, billions of dollars spent for reconstruction. And what did we have? What did we achieve after this war? I mean, here you could think rationally and say, this is a bad conflict. It could have been avoided, given our political outcomes that we achieve after, dividing the parliament half and half between Muslim and Christians, changing some political reforms that we attained through the, after post-conflict period. So these are, I think, that's where conflict resolution and people who would like to work on preventing conflict from happening must invest tremendous efforts in avoiding what I call bad conflict from a rational perspective.
And I think that the challenge I would just bring back to that is the trauma piece. Because oftentimes, you know, I've been in negotiation rooms in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Yemen, very, very different contexts. But what really struck me in each of the processes was how traumatized people were. And you know, we would say, this is going to be lose-lose. There's no way you're going to win this battle. And they would say, but is the other side going to bleed? Like, I would literally be in negotiations where I'm saying, but it's our turn. You know, no rational conversation, dorna, it's our turn. You know, they've had power for this long, it's our turn to have power. So willing to see the whole country burn for their turn. And so that's usually a pace of trauma. That's usually where people are trying to think. And if negotiators are only negotiating from a place of interest, we lose that whole trauma piece. And we're like, why is no one agreeing to this? Why are they letting the country burn? Because we're often ignoring the trauma piece. I do want to mention the media because I think it's absolutely essential, because media, like any other tool, can be used positively or negatively. And a lot of the trainings that we do is something we call conflict-sensitive journalism, how to actually make sure journalists are sensitive to what triggers conflict. So for example, in Iraq, like a lot of the journalists, anytime there was a bomb, they would like zero in on a message just because it looks so like it's a great, you know, 2-second kind of B-roll to slide into, you know, the main story. And if it was a Sunni or a Shia mosque, they were actually inciting violence. And simply through the training, when we were able to point that out, they started using different B-roll versus the mosque as a B-roll. So there's certain simple things for those who are unintentional. Now, for those who are intentional, I really don't think there's much to be done because it's usually more propaganda than journalism. But there is conflict sensitive. And then when I went into Benghazi, my whole first trip in Libya was 100% social media. Didn't do one email, one phone call, it was 100% social media. So when things got shut down, social media can be a really good back channel to activists. Oftentimes that's how I connect with activists. There's a lot of security that you should be aware of if you do use social media, but and other elements, once you're trained on that, there's, you know, certain protocols, but I'm a huge, huge, huge fan of social media. It's what connects me.
If I may add one more point on social media, what shocks me always is the fact that the people who write or produce things on social media don't realize that this is going, you know, international. What he said or what she said is going to be seen by millions, and it's going to be reacted to by millions. So if it is something positive, it could be positive for millions, and something negative is going to be negative for millions. I just don't see that the people realize that whenever they use social media. I think this is a big danger. A very small example that we've lived in Lebanon, probably over the last month. We've had the army clashing with people, with terrorist groups on the eastern border on that. And we've had discussion over the social media whether the army is first should do it or not, or whether on another level, whether the army is violating the human rights of refugees or not. And third, of course, the eternal discussion between whether the army should do it or the resistance should do it, etc. I've just had, on the issue of, we had 4 people who died in custody of the Lebanese army. The army report was that they died for health reasons. But again, on that week, I saw pictures about army soldiers, you know, stepping on the heads of people and lashing people with hoses, etc. It turned out that 99% of the pictures sent over the internet in that week were not even in Lebanon or by Lebanese army. We just saw pictures from Ersel, life, now. The army is doing that, the people are suffering, etc. And none of these were actually true, and there was no way to verify whether these pictures are true or not. And of course, this would have slided Lebanon into a civil war, as serious as that, in my opinion. And the people who sent these pictures, I mean, I don't know what were they thinking, whether, you know, was it intentional, or was it simply, you know, forwarding pictures, unconscious of the effect of what could have led to.
Just following what you're saying, whenever we have a conflict, it is us versus them. There is a segregation and us versus them. Is media a positive tool or a negative tool? There are no answers to this. It's how I'm using it. If I want to Google to have some backup that media is a negative tool, I find thousands of resources. And if I want to Google to show that media is a positive tool, also I have thousands of resources. And here when we come again to the evidence base, are the sources trustworthy? Are we forwarding something that really is has been proved that it's a true thing? Are we segregated ourselves? Do we want to believe? And this is where, again, we go back to the person. What we need to do, information are there, hundreds of information. It's about around the human being, about the analytical thinking, about how he could filter and how he could analyze if this is positive or this is negative. How do I want to do with this media I'm hearing? Do I want? Sometimes we are listening to different sources, but we just listen to what we want to listen. And we just turn out deaf on what we don't want to hear and listen. So it's what we want to do as a human being when we are listening and how we are participating in spreading wrong or positive news.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So.
أنا سالم من الأردن. سؤالي لحضرتك، أنا ممكن اسمح لي ما أكون معك بأنه حضرتك تكلمت أن الحرب هي ليست حرب دينية. ممكن دكتور إلي بعرف مع أديان وتعددية أنه جلسنا على طاولة واحدة كنا من متعددي الأديان أو اللامعتقد، فرأينا وتوصلنا بأن حتى الأديان تأسست على شكل سياسي وكان مبدأها سياسي، وبالتالي هي حرب سياسية نعم، ولكن تأخذ الدين أو المعتقد أو اللامعتقد كذريعة لها. بالنسبة لأطفال العالم، يعني حضرتك تكلمتي عن تبسيط اللغة، ومن ثم تكلمتي بأنه الأهل لا يفهموا الورشة وبيسألوا إنه الورشة متى بدها تنتهي، وبعدين تكلمتي بأنه هاي الجمعية لها جهة مانحة، ممكن يعني في شد وجذب ما بين إعطاء يعني جهة مانحة لهذه الجمعية. طب كمسمى لأطفال العالم، يعني امبارح سمعنا مقتبس جميل بأنه إذا أردت أن تعرف المستقبل فاصنعه أنت. طيب بين إيدين حضراتكم هي أهم شريحة للمستقبل، يعني ممكن هؤلاء الأطفال هم يكونون قياديو المستقبل، ممكن يكونوا صانعون قرار غدا في المستقبل. طيب إذا كانت الجمعية ما بتتحمل هاي المسؤولية وحضرتك بتحكي إنه إحنا لازم نشارك في الأمن السياسي والسلمي، حضرتكم مش مطلوبين بالأمن السلمي والسياسي، حضرتكم مطلوبين إنه أنتم تهتموا في شريحة معينة وتركزوا عليها اللي هي الأطفال. شكرا.
I don't know who would like to. Sorry?
Do you want to take more questions?
Yes. The woman over there. Yes.
I believe or I think that there is a mistrust between media and civil society. Many media organizations believe in or use the numbers because they need them mainly, or because they trust the numbers, but they don't trust the actions. What do you think?
Okay. And then one more here.
شكرا لكم جميعا. أتوجه بسؤال للأستاذ منال. تحدثت عن أتوجه بسؤالي للأستاذ منال. تحدثت عن وجود نزاعات بين المهنيين موجودة في جميع المجتمعات، بين فجوة بين الأكاديميين والمهنيين، وتحدثت عن حلول كانت مطروحة وكانت قابلة للتطبيق لفض النزاعات بين المهنيين خصوصا. وكان من كلامكم واضح انه الحوار والتشاركيه بين المهنيين هي افضل السبل لفض النزاعات. في مجتمعنا الاردني يوجد لاجئين، ومن خلال حديثكم تبين انه اسقاط لقب اللاجئ او اسم اللاجئ على اللاجئ لاذابه الفروقات الاجتماعيه هو احد الحلول. في الأردن تم محاولة عدم إسقاط اسم لاجئ على اللاجئ من باب إدارة الفروقات مع المواطن الأردني لفرض النزاعات الموجودة بين المهنيين، خصوصا وأنه السوري يزاحم المواطن الأردني على العمل بسعر أقل وبمهنية ممكن أكثر. فاكتشفنا بأنه فعليا عدم إسقاط هوية لاجئ على اللاجئ تؤدي إلى تقويض المواطن الأردني إلى رفض قبول اللاجئ السوري، يعني بلغتنا إعلان رفض قبول المواطن بشكل علني، وأصبح هو خطاب كراهية بعد أن كان رأي سري يعني بين الشخص ونفسه، أنا لا أقبل اللاجئ في مجتمعي. لكن بعد طرح الحلول اللي تفضلتوا فيها تبين أنه المواطن الأردني بدأ يعلن عن رأيه بشكل علني وأصبح خطاب كراهية، وبالتالي انتقلنا من وضع إدارة الفروقات إلى حلول لخطاب كراهية، فبالتالي أصبحت المشكلة أكبر. وشكرا.
Okay, so the 3 quite different questions. I don't know who would like to start fielding them. We only have a few minutes left.
Quickly on 2 things. Whether it's religious war or not, this is a very long discussion. We can go back to the Crusades and discuss whether these were religious wars or not. I think what I said was about Yemen, that I didn't say it was, but it was not religious war. What I said is, looking at the problem in Yemen as one between Shia and Sunni is wrong, because factually is wrong. The Zaydis are not Shia, and the problem in Yemen was not religious at all. So religion can be used, like identity could be used. The war in Darfur was seen as an ethnic conflict. I worked in Darfur for 2 years and I realized that it was not an ethnic conflict. It was said Arab versus Africans. I mean, I already have a problem with whether Arabs are Africans or not. I mean, most Arabs live in Africa, so are they Africans or not? What is Africanness? So these kind of things are very tricky, and that's why we need academics, serious academics, to look into these things. Now for media, it's the same problem, and I agree with my colleagues here, is that it can be a positive tool and a bad one. It depends how we use it. It can inflame the conflict, or it can help solve it. So we have to be careful when reading an article or looking at social media posts, because it's being used. And unfortunately, in most of these countries today, and we were together in Libya, it's very hard to distinguish what is a rumor from what is a fact, because everything goes through social media, but you have to deal with it because that's how people build their perception, that's how they act.
I'd like to add Mr. Youness's comments. Indeed, it's really difficult to identify whether a conflict in Yemen or elsewhere is of particular causation, like we're using here in academia, or independent variables. It's very important to distinguish, in my view, between different levels of conflict, whether these conflicts are local, whether they're national, or regional, or international. So, you know, we have to divide the problem and look at it according to the levels. But still, because conflicts are pretty much, some of it are rational, some of it irrational, what we end up having is really that every conflict has its own dynamic. That's why a conflict resolution brings in mapping. We map, we try to figure out what causes this particular conflict. Is it religion? Is it economic? Is it identity? Is it geographic disputes? And so every conflict, in my view, has, in a way, its own dynamic, though it may share aspects of conflict with others. That's why academia is very important, because it has this database where it can compare different conflicts and figure out what is common between one or another common, and try to propose certain or particular interventions. And this is why also what is important is the local experience. And the practitioners working on the ground can feed in information and feed in more knowledge to how this conflict, being a particular conflict in Rabin, what causing it. So we could suggest as academia and as practitioners to decision makers, to policies, to negotiators, how to intervene and provide a conflict resolution to that particular. So it's very important to bridge the academia with the practitioners from a local perspective, and perhaps be able to provide a think tank forum for decision makers.
Just briefly?
Briefly, I would say I always push. There's never one root of conflict, ever. It's usually multiple drivers. And I think the other thing is a little bit, is perception is reality. I always tell my team, whether it's true or not, if you hear the rumor mill, assume it's true, because perception becomes reality on the ground in war zones.
بس بسرعة رح أجاوب بالعربي. يلي قلت نحن ما بنشتغل بحل النزاعات على صعيد عالي، بس بنشتغل على الأطفال تنحسن الأطفال ونفرجيهم نموذج آخر، لأنه مثل ما أنت عم تقولي هن الغد وهن المستقبل، فيشوفوا بهالساعتين اللي بيجوا على النشاطات وبعملنا معهم إنه في شيء ثاني من دون تطرق للعنف ممكن يحقق نتيجة. هذا يعني كثير بسرعة، مش بالعكس، كل شغلنا مركز على الأطفال، على الأهل وعلى المجتمع يلي حول الأطفال، تنجرب رغم إنه الظروف منا مؤاتية نفرجي إنه في شيء بينشغل، رغم وقت واحد يبلش من حاله مش ضروري ننطر الحل يجي من غيرنا.
كمان بسرعة كثير، وخلينا بدون الترجمة تنوضح الشغلات يمكن بشكل أوضح. بالنسبة للهويات، أنا برأيي كل إنسان مركب من عدة هويات بطبيعة الحال، وحدة منهم الدينية، وحدة منهم العرقية، الاقتصادية وإلى آخره. إذا عندي مشكلة بوحدة منهم رح تكمش فيها وصير تحسسها كأنه هي هويتي الوحيدة المهددة واللي لازم دافع وموت عنها. بالمقابل أهين طريقة تبلش حل النزاع إنه ضويله على هويات الثانيين، وقديش عنده أشياء مشتركة مع الناس الثانيين يلي عندهم هالهويات ذاتها والهموم المشتركة ذاتها. بموضوع الأرقام والجمعيات، أكيد الميديا بيهمها السكوب، إنه أعطيني الرقم، أعطيني الخبرية من آخرها. وكثير قليل ما عم نلاقي كجمعيات مجتمع مدني إنه الميديا مهتمة بالقضية كقضية. غالباً ما بيكون الشخص الإعلامي بمحل معين، إذا حظنا حلو بنلاقي هالفرد يلي هو مهتم بالقضية ويلي بجرب إنه يروج لها بمحل معين ومش على طول بيقدر. إنما الميديا بالإجمال للأسف مهتمة بس بالسكوب أو بالرقم، مش مهتمة بالقضية. هذا اللي عم نختبره. آخر شيء بالنسبة لموضوع اللاجئين بالأردن، بس يمكن منال ما جاوبت على الموضوع. مش الفكرة إنه لا أنا حسسه إنه هو مواطن وعمله على هالأساس، كانت الفكرة اللي عم تحكي عنها منال إنه أنا بالتعابير يلي بستعملها من ناحية بعلاقتي معه مش ضروري أقعد صنف الناس ووجه له إياها وأطرق النظرية إنه أنت كذا ولا كذا. أنا هيدا شيء ممكن أعمله أنا بالخلفية تبعولي، ولكن بالتعاطي معه أتعاطى معه كإنسان وبشكل إيجابي ما وصل له الرسالة بشكل حد ونظري. هذا بس كان المقصود.
تمام.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of our time. I wanted to thank this very talented panel for sharing some of what is, I'm sure, a lot more of their experience, their knowledge, and I would, excuse me, I would also urge all of you to continue in your interest in bridging such a divide, because of course the media does have a great role in doing so. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manal, for putting together this beautiful panel. Sorry, حنروح هلا على الكوفي بريك برا، وبس نرجع عنا حلقة نقاش حول تصوير العنف ضد المرأة بالإعلام، وحول تصوير الأقليات المهمشة والمغتربين.